I want to be upfront about who I was before any of this happened, because it matters for what comes next. I was not a Linux person. I was not someone who spent weekends in terminal windows arguing about package managers on forums, the kind of person who has an opinion about init systems ready to go at a moment's notice. I was a comfortable, committed Windows user who had built my own PC, learned video editing on it, and knew my way around the registry, the services menu, and the group policy editor well enough that friends called me when their machines broke. I defended Windows in comment sections. I told people Linux was for developers, not normal people who just need their computer to work. Then came late 2025, and a single moment that changed how I thought about the whole relationship, because that's genuinely what it is, a relationship. And it had quietly become a one-sided one. I was deep into a project, hours into a workflow with multiple applications, open and unsaved progress scattered across all of them. Exactly the kind of session where an interruption doesn't just annoy you, it costs you real, unrecoverable work. Windows picked that exact moment to tell me it would restart in 15 minutes to install updates. I tried to pause it. The system told me I needed to install a different update first. Before pausing, anything would even be allowed. I tried disabling the update service manually. I tried a third-party blocker. The computer restarted anyway, on its own schedule, indifferent to mine. When it came back, my open work was gone, and sitting on top of the lock screen was a fresh advertisement for Microsoft 365, layered directly over wallpaper I had never chosen and didn't want. What made that moment land so hard wasn't really the lost work. Frustrating as that was, it was the timing. Because 2025 and early 2026 turned out to be a genuinely rough stretch for Windows 11 specifically. One bad update compounding into the next, in a way that felt less like bad luck and more like a pattern. In January 2026, Microsoft shipped a security update, KB 507411109, that left a subset of commercial Windows 11 machines in what the company later described internally as an improper state after a failed December 2025 update, rolled back incorrectly. Devices caught in that state started throwing unmountable boot volume errors, a black screen, and a message telling you your device had run into a problem, full stop. No further help offered in the moment. NVIDIA was dealing with its own fallout from that same January update, publicly recommending that gamers experiencing crashes, artifacting, and black screens simply uninstall it while the company scrambled to patch around whatever Microsoft had broken. Then came February 10th, 2026, and the update KB 5077181 that was actually supposed to fix the unmountable boot volume mess from January. It did fix that specific bug. It also introduced a brand new one, triggering infinite restart loops on a fresh set of machines, some users reporting more than 15 consecutive reboot cycles without ever reaching a usable desktop, compounded by system event notification service errors, and DHCP failures that killed internet connectivity, even when the network cable was plugged in and working fine. Microsoft's own guidance to affected users, published in its support documentation while a real fix was still in progress, was to uninstall the update through Control Panel and pause future updates manually. Sit with that for a second. The instruction for a mandatory forced update that broke your computer was to remove the mandatory forced update yourself. And what was Microsoft spending its actual engineering and product attention on throughout this exact same stretch of cascading update failures? Copilot. Embedding it into Notepad, into the snipping tool, into Photos, into File Explorer, into the taskbar itself, impossible to fully ignore no matter what you were trying to do on your own machine. One widely read piece of Windows-focused tech coverage put it about as plainly as this kind of criticism ever gets phrased, that a real part of the underlying problem was simply where Microsoft's focus had gone, that while foundational parts of the operating system kept breaking release after release, the company kept pouring its energy into pushing AI features into every visible corner of the interface instead of stabilizing what was already there. That Copilot situation is where things stopped feeling merely frustrating and started feeling genuinely invasive. Between October 2025 and March 2026, Microsoft quietly, automatically installed the Microsoft 365 Copilot application onto the computers of Microsoft 365 subscribers. Not offered, not suggested with a dismissible prompt, installed without anyone clicking yes to that specific thing. And during that same rollout window, a serious bug surfaced, later tracked internally under the identifier CW1226324, first reported by customers on January 21st, 2026. The bug allowed Copilot Chat's so-called work tab to read and summarize emails sitting in a user's sent and draft folders, including messages explicitly marked confidential with active data loss prevention labels attached. Labels that were specifically supposed to wall that content off from exactly this kind of automated processing. Microsoft's own statement described it plainly as a code issue improperly allowing labeled items to be picked up anyway. An application nobody had asked to install was reading protected email content it was explicitly configured not to touch. Microsoft began shipping a fix in early February 2026 and paused the forced installations entirely by mid-March, acknowledging, in effect, that the rollout had gone badly enough to warrant a full stop. Then, in June 2026, Microsoft resumed the forced installations again, this time targeting full completion by July 1st. Force it. Break something serious. Apologize. Pause. Force it again on a deadline. That is not the behavior of a company that treats the boundary between its own product roadmap and your personal data as something worth respecting. That's a company that has decided your computer is a deployment surface for whatever it wants to ship next, and that your consent is, at most, a scheduling inconvenience to be worked around on someone else's timeline, not yours. I want to be fair here, because fairness actually matters if the rest of this is going to mean anything. Microsoft did eventually announce real changes in March 2026, promising fewer visible Copilot entry points scattered through the interface, an easier way to disable ads inside the Start menu, and a renewed public commitment to prioritizing basic stability over new feature pushes. Coverage of that announcement in the Windows enthusiast press largely framed it as Microsoft finally, publicly conceding that the operating system's priorities had drifted somewhere it shouldn't have. I read every word of that announcement carefully, and what struck me wasn't the content of the promises themselves. It was the obvious fact that not one of those changes emerged from some internal, values-driven reconsideration. Every one of them was a direct, visible response to collapsing user trust, a stagnating share of the desktop market, and a tech community that had increasingly adopted the word enshittification as the standard, almost clinical vocabulary for describing exactly what had happened to Windows. Improvements that only arrive once market pressure forces the issue aren't the same thing as improvements that come from actually respecting the people using your product, and understanding that specific difference is exactly what finally pushed me, after 2 full decades on Windows, to go find out what Linux genuinely looked like in the middle of 2026, not what a decade-old forum thread insisted it looked like. Here's what I expected walking in. A command line staring back at me, demanding I manually hunt down and configure drivers, maybe compile something from raw source code, practically requiring a computer science background just to get a Wi-Fi connection working. That image had been sitting in my head for years, built almost entirely out of old forum horror stories, ancient YouTube tutorials, and the confident secondhand opinions of other Windows users who, as it turned out, had never actually tried Linux themselves either. I downloaded Ubuntu first, since it has the largest community and the most available documentation, used Rufus to flash the installer onto a USB drive, booted from it, and within about 40 seconds, I was looking at a fully functional desktop. No installation or commitment required yet, just a live session running entirely off the USB stick so I could poke around before touching my actual system at all. I sat there for a moment, genuinely surprised, because none of it matched what I'd pictured. The desktop was clean and organized, the animations ran smoothly, Firefox opened immediately, YouTube played without a hitch. I opened LibreOffice, built a test document and a quick spreadsheet, and poked through the interface. It felt different from Microsoft Office the way Chrome feels different from Edge. Not unfamiliar exactly, just differently arranged around logic that's genuinely easy to pick up within minutes. Then I tested the part I was actually nervous about, my own hardware. A gaming mouse with programmable buttons, a mechanical keyboard with RGB lighting, or a dedicated USB audio interface for recording, external storage drives, a Wi-Fi adapter. On Windows, roughly half of that list required manufacturer-specific software, manual driver downloads, and periodic reinstallation whenever an update quietly broke something that had been working fine the day before. On Ubuntu, running entirely live off a USB drive with zero prior configuration, every single piece was detected immediately. The keyboard's RGB lit up correctly, the mouse's extra buttons registered. The audio interface showed up as a proper output option in sound settings without me touching anything. Wi-Fi connected on the very first attempt. Bluetooth paired my headphones without any prompting from me at all. I genuinely double-checked that I hadn't accidentally installed something extra, because it felt too easy to be the actual out-of-box experience. That was the first real crack in 2 decades of accumulated assumptions. I spent the following weeks doing serious, methodical homework before committing to anything permanent, working through comparison videos, digging through months of Linux community discussion threads, and specifically seeking out accounts from people who had switched from a genuine Windows Power user background, rather than lifelong Linux users who never had a comparison point in the first place. What came up consistently was that the whole conversation around Linux desktop usability had shifted meaningfully in just the few years leading up to 2026. Linux Mint with the Cinnamon desktop kept getting recommended for the most familiar transition, its taskbar, file manager, and settings layout mapping almost directly onto what a longtime Windows user already knows instinctively. Zorin OS came up for similar reasons, offering an explicit Windows-style layout option right in its installer. For people wanting something more modern and visually polished, KDE Plasma running on Kubuntu was the standout recommendation, and that's ultimately what I chose myself. Software compatibility was the question I kept circling back to, because it was the one legitimate concern I actually had. I do video editing, photo work, rely on communication tools and browsers constantly, and use a handful of daily productivity applications. So I went through my real installed software list program by program and checked each one specifically for 2026 era Linux support. DaVinci Resolve has had a genuine native Linux version for years now, the same application with no meaningful compromises. OBS Studio, Audacity, Blender, and VS Code are all fully native on Linux as well. Discord and Spotify both ship official Linux clients. Steam, which deserves its own separate conversation entirely, is fully native with years of dedicated Valve engineering behind it. Browsers are a non-issue, since Firefox, Chrome, and Brave all run identically to how they do anywhere else. Photo editing needed the most honest assessment of anything on my list. GIMP is the open source tool that comes up most often as the Photoshop alternative, and I want to be straightforward about it rather than oversell it. It is not Photoshop. The interface differs, the workflow differs, and if you're carrying 15 years of Photoshop muscle memory the way I was, there's a genuine adjustment period ahead of you. But GIMP handles layers, masks, curves, filters, and color correction competently, and for the large majority of everyday photo editing tasks that don't demand a highly specialized professional pipeline, it gets the job done without drama. Darktable, for raw photo processing specifically, genuinely impressed me with its output quality. And for the specific handful of situations where I knew I'd still want Photoshop itself, Wine exists as a compatibility layer, translating Windows application calls into something Linux can actually execute. I tested Photoshop CS6 running through Wine before making any final decisions, and it ran without crashing, without visual glitches, and without any behavior I'd call unreliable. The overall compatibility picture in 2026 is meaningfully better than it was even 2 or 3 years earlier. Now, gaming, because this single question keeps more people anchored to Windows than any other factor combined, and it deserves real numbers rather than vague reassurance. Valve has spent years building Proton, a compatibility layer translating Windows game API calls into something Linux can run in real time, and the Steam Deck, running Valve's own SteamOS built on a Linux foundation, forced serious, sustained investment into making that technology reliable at genuine scale, since millions of people were suddenly depending on it as their primary gaming device. By late 2025 and into 2026, ProtonDB's own community-sourced compatibility data reported that roughly 89.7% of Windows game titles now launch successfully on Linux, either through native support or through Proton, with a meaningful share of new releases earning the platform's top platinum compatibility rating within days of launch. Steam's own library has ballooned past 100,000 playable titles once Proton compatibility is factored in, expanded far beyond the roughly 9,000 games that ship with genuinely native Linux builds. Going through my own Steam library before switching, the compatibility ratio I found matched those broader numbers closely. Nearly everything I actually play regularly either had a native Linux build or carried a gold or platinum rating on ProtonDB, the community database, where players report their real tested experience running specific titles through Proton. What doesn't work is almost entirely limited to games running kernel-level anti-cheat systems that publishers have simply chosen not to extend Linux support to, a business decision on their end rather than a technical wall on Linux's side. Valorant, running Riot's Vanguard anti-cheat, remains the most commonly cited example, since Vanguard still doesn't support Linux at all. If that's a title you play competitively and can't live without, that's a real, specific limitation worth weighing honestly, rather than a small footnote. For essentially everything else, the compatibility picture by mid-2026 is genuinely strong. So I made the decision, not impulsively and not purely out of frustration, but after weeks of methodical testing and an honest accounting of what I'd actually gain against what I'd genuinely give up. I backed up everything that mattered to an external drive, flashed the Kubuntu installer to a USB stick, booted from it one final time to confirm everything still worked as expected, and clicked install. I chose to erase the drive completely. No dual boot, no safety net partition holding Windows in reserve as an escape hatch. I want to explain that specific choice because plenty of guides recommend dual booting as the safer starting point, and the logic behind that advice is reasonable. But for me personally, having Windows sitting one reboot away would have meant reaching for it the instant something on Linux required even 30 minutes of research to solve. Full commitment was the exact friction that forced me to actually learn the new environment instead of retreating to familiar ground the moment anything asked real effort of me. The installation itself took 14 minutes, timed. 14 minutes from clicking install to sitting at a fully configured KDE Plasma desktop. No product key to hunt down anywhere. No mandatory Microsoft account requiring an active internet connection just to finish setting up a computer I already owned outright. No string of nearly identical screens asking in slightly different wording each time whether I was absolutely certain I didn't want telemetry, an advertising identifier, activity history tracking, cloud sync, and a voice assistant all switched on by default. Just a handful of direct questions about language, keyboard layout, time zone, and a username, then 14 minutes, then done. The contrast against a fresh Windows 11 install, which I'd gone through recently enough to remember clearly, was stark. That setup process is a genuine gauntlet of dark patterns, an express settings button that quietly enables a dozen data collection features simultaneously, an option to skip Microsoft account creation deliberately buried harder to find than the option to create one, the entire flow engineered to extract as many agreements as possible from someone who just wants to reach their desktop. Linux Mint, by comparison, asked me where I live and what I wanted to call my account. That difference in philosophy between the two setup experiences tells you almost everything you need to know about how each operating system actually regards the person sitting in front of it. The first week on KDE Plasma involved real adjustment, and I want to be honest about that, rather than pretend the transition was frictionless. There were genuine muscle memory moments, reaching for keyboard shortcuts that didn't exist, hunting for settings tucked somewhere unfamiliar. Package management was the steepest part of the learning curve specifically for me. On Windows, installing software typically means visiting a website, downloading an executable, running an installer, and hoping the download source you clicked was actually legitimate rather than a lookalike. On Linux, it means opening a software center and searching by name, or opening a terminal and typing one command that pulls directly from verified official repositories. The terminal approach felt unfamiliar at first, but within a few days, it was clearly faster and meaningfully safer. No more sorting through search results trying to guess which link is the real download and which is a malvertising trap built to look identical to it. The customization reality of KDE Plasma caught me off guard even after reading about it extensively beforehand. On Windows 11, customization essentially tops out at light or dark mode, one accent color, and whether taskbar icons sit centered or left aligned, with anything beyond that requiring third-party tools and registry edits that a future update can silently break without warning. On KDE Plasma, that same customization is native, stable, and genuinely comprehensive. I moved my taskbar to the left in about 4 clicks, changed the application launcher's style, set distinct wallpapers across separate virtual desktops, adjusted animation speed, enabled window blur, configured exactly how windows behave when snapped to screen edges, and set up a hot corner that reveals every open window when my cursor hits the top left. Every one of those was a built-in toggle or slider, not a workaround, not a hack liable to break on the next patch. I spent most of a weekend simply tuning the environment to look and behave exactly how I wanted. And after years of Microsoft deciding how my own interface should look regardless of my preferences, that felt like something close to genuine ownership of the machine sitting in front of me. By the second week, performance differences became impossible to ignore, showing up in ways I genuinely wasn't looking for and couldn't easily explain away as imagination. My system now boots in under 10 seconds flat, power button to a fully loaded desktop with startup applications already running. The same hardware, same SSD, same amount of RAM, took a consistent 35 to 40 seconds to reach a usable desktop under Windows 11, even with fast startup enabled. Application launch times are faster across the board. The file manager opens instantly, and a browser window with a dozen restored tabs comes back in seconds rather than dragging. Memory usage was the difference that actually surprised me most. My typical baseline, a browser, a messaging app, music playing, usually some background task running, consumed somewhere around 65 to 70% of available RAM on Windows 11, leaving the whole system feeling sluggish the moment I asked it to do anything demanding on top of that. The identical baseline under KDE Plasma sits around 35 to 40%. Same hardware, same tasks, dramatically less overhead, because the operating system underneath isn't simultaneously running a telemetry pipeline, an AI assistant, a cloud sync service, and a peer-to-peer update delivery process, all quietly competing for the same limited resources in the background the entire time. Then there's the privacy question, which is really where everything in this story converges. On Windows 11, I spent genuine time and effort trying to minimize how much data left my machine, working through every privacy toggle, disabling optional telemetry, turning off activity history, even reaching for third-party utilities to catch settings the built-in menu couldn't touch. Then a major update would arrive and quietly reset a chunk of those settings back to their defaults, without ever telling me. Reporting throughout 2025 and into 2026 documented that reset pattern repeatedly and consistently. It isn't a bug, it's closer to a structural feature of a platform where data collection is the assumed default state, and any privacy configuration you set up is treated as a temporary exception, periodically cleared away. On Linux, there's no telemetry unless I explicitly opt into it myself. No advertising identifier baked in. No activity history quietly syncing to a corporate server somewhere. No AI assistant scanning through my files in the background without being asked. My operating system doesn't phone home. It runs my applications, manages my hardware, and otherwise genuinely stays out of my way. And the sheer absence of that constant low-level surveillance is something I didn't fully register until it was actually gone. Because you rarely notice the weight of something you've been carrying until the moment you finally set it down. What I didn't expect, going in, was to end up more productive rather than simply even. I'd braced for a rough learning curve followed by something roughly equivalent to what I'd had on Windows, just with meaningfully better privacy attached. That was the trade I assumed I was making going in. What actually happened turned out differently. Within a month of fully committing, my entire workflow felt noticeably faster, not marginally, but measurably. Editing video without background processes, constantly competing for the same system, resources meant the machine was actually dedicating its full power to editing video, rather than splitting attention between my work and some telemetry pipeline quietly deciding what to send home. No forced update interruptions meant working through an entire session without the low-grade anxiety of a restart countdown appearing at the worst conceivable moment. No ads embedded in the interface meant that every time I opened an application or a settings menu, I was looking at my own tools and genuinely nothing else. Each of those sounds small in isolation. Stacked together across every single day, they change the entire texture of how work actually feels. I know the objections sitting in your head right now because the exact same ones sat in mine for years, and they deserve honest answers instead of dismissal. Yes, there's a learning curve, and I won't pretend otherwise, but here's its real shape. The first 2 weeks demand genuine adjustment, some searching, some time spent reading through forum threads, occasionally opening a terminal to paste in a command someone posted. After those 2 weeks, daily computing on Linux isn't harder than daily computing on Windows. It's different, and different simply isn't the same thing as difficult. The skills you build during that adjustment period genuinely belong to you afterward too. When I eventually resolved a printer issue on Linux after roughly an hour of research, I understood precisely what I'd changed and why it worked. When I used to fix comparable Windows printer issues by downloading whatever installer the manufacturer offered and clicking through it blindly, I understood essentially nothing about what had actually happened, and had no real ability to handle a slightly different version of the same problem the next time it came up. Linux asks a bit more of you up front and hands back genuine competence in return. Windows holds your hand in a way that quietly produces dependence instead of real understanding. And after 20 years of that trade, without ever quite noticing I was making it, that difference is the one that ended up mattering most of all.